Hi everyone, you probably remembered this video. We did this before we had some of our modern microphones and equipment, so I'm going to do it over. Is Matthew 5:19 a prophecy by Jesus against Paul? This is presented to you by YouTube channel Jesus Words Only Studies. I hope this will be a video that you'll want to share with others because this, I think, is a very convicting video that will help your friends, if they're on the fence, to know that Jesus Christ already prophesied about Paul and not to follow him. And it couldn't be more clear. This is like unequivocal. Let's be clear. If you don't accept that it's a prophecy against Paul by Jesus, the only alternative is you have to believe that, and this is what many scholars try to suggest, that Matthew 5:19 is a hateful anti-Paul slander by the apostles, particularly Matthew. So that's really the choice you have once you're informed of what's going on in this passage. So let's listen to Matthew 5:19, but we're going to read it from the Young's Literal because they're the only ones who have the Greek grammar reflected correctly in here, and I'll explain what that means in a second. Whoever therefore may loose one of these commands, the least, and may teach men so, least he shall be called in the reign of the heavens. But whoever may do and may teach them, he shall be called great in the reign of the heavens. Matthew 5:19. Now, if you don't know, what came before is Jesus had said, I've not come to destroy the law and the prophets. And now he's going to say, anyone who would loose even the least of these commandments of the law and the prophets, least he shall be called in the reign of the heavens. And that's the key part of the grammar there is this person is not in heaven. He will be called in the reign of heaven the least. So it's a name that he'll be forever remembered for. His name means least. But whoever may do and may teach them the law, he shall be called great in the reign of the heavens. So that's another moral lesson. Like if you're teaching the law, that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. You're not a heretic. You're not sending people to hell. You're not giving them 613 commands. You're giving them those commands that apply to them, which when it's talking about Gentiles, that's the sojourners and foreigners. And we have some passages that do apply to us in the God's law, and the rest apply to sons of Israel. Okay, so anyway, that's the verse that we're going to be looking at. So just so we have it clear, is the word commands in Matthew 5:19 is a reference back to the law here. Jesus says in Matthew 5:17, "Do not suppose that I came to throw down the law or the prophets." And he means the law given Moses by God. Okay, everyone. So the first thing we're going to look at is the first prong. This prophesies of a law loosener. Okay, let's highlight that. So this is what we're aiming at. Who will be called by the name of least. See that word? So this is his what? His name. He'll be called least by those who are in the kingdom of heaven. And now we'll see he's the least is not in the kingdom. Okay, right? You can see that. But those in the kingdom are described as those who do and teach the commandments of God. It is those in the kingdom, the great, who call a law loosener by the name of the least one. Okay. So I think this is very clear. So Saul is Shaul in Hebrew, and that name means asked for. So asked for does not mean least. So that wouldn't be where we would think Paul has this name least. Paul was a Roman citizen by birth. He says so, and this is recorded in Acts 22 verse 28. And then, and thus to have a Latin name, he must have had a Latin name on his birth records. In other words, to be born that way, he had to have a Latin name. Because you can't be a Roman citizen using a Jewish name. First of all, it wouldn't correspond to anything. You could write in Hebrew, it wouldn't mean anything. So you have to have a Roman name. This is in the book by Harold Johnston, The Private Life of Romans, 1932, chapter 2. Okay, so Paul has to have, or Paul, he has to have a Latin name. So that Latin name from birth was Paulus. See? So we know that the word Paulos is a Greek transliteration of a Latin name. How do we know that? You can go to the translation the reference of Strong's, and this is in Blue Letter Bible, and it will say here's the word Paulus, and it's a proper masculine noun, and it is of Latin origin. Do you see that? Okay, so clearly Paulos is not a Greek word, it is a Latin word, and it's just simply modified to look more like Greek with an OS, but in Latin it's US. And so when he was born, he was Shaul, his Hebrew name, and he had a Latin name because to have a birth certificate, you had to have, to be a Roman citizen, you had to have a Latin name on it, as that text I quoted in the prior panel shows. So he was Paulus from birth. That's what his name was. And what does that name mean? Well, first of all, we have to know that Paul actually knows what his name means because he plays on the meaning of his name. Now, no one in the early church knew his name meant least, just so you know. It required a sophisticated person named Augustine to know why Paul says this in 1 Corinthians 15 verse 9. And this person was Augustine. He says, when he read this, so this is what Paul says in that passage. For I am the least of the apostles and do not even deserve to be called an apostle because I persecuted the church of God. So Paul refers to himself as the elichistos in Greek. That was the masculine ending of the adjective, but it could just have been, depends on what it's modifying. So it can be elichiston, it can be elichistos, depends on what it's modifying. So he calls himself the least, and Augustine recognizes this as we'll go through, and he goes, Paul is playing on the meaning of his name in Latin. And why would Augustine know that, and how sophisticated a knowledge do you have to have of Latin to know and recognize what Paul's doing here? Because otherwise this just goes right by anybody else. You've never thought he's referring to his own name, right? You would have to know a very high level knowledge of Latin to know this, and that's who Augustine is. He's a speaker. He lives in Rome. He's a speaker of Latin. He knew what Paul was referring to, the Latin meaning of his Latin Roman birth name. Just to show you, this has not gone by without being noticed by scholars. So in the late 1900s, this was starting to be discussed, and now it can be mentioned without shame or shock about what this means. Why in 1 Corinthians 15:9 Paul refers to him as the least. This is in Jameson Fawcett's Brown's Bible Commentary. They point out that the meaning of Paul's true name is, in its original Latin, is the name Paulus in Latin means least. Okay, and we'll find out why. And again, the important thing here is how sophisticated a knowledge Matthew. If Matthew's the source of this, because as I said in the very first two slides, either Jesus is making a prophecy or the apostle Matthew has an extremely sophisticated knowledge of Latin that Matthew, could have known that Paulus means least. It's not something, as we'll prove by the end of this, the only two people who knew that Paul's name was least was Paul and his mother or father. Okay, that's it. Because nobody else would know that in a culture that speaks Hebrew primarily or Aramaic. Paul was playing on the meaning of his name as least in 1 Corinthians 15:9 because the Latin version of his name on his Roman birth certificate meant least. And we'll see how difficult it would be to know and decipher Paulus meant least. Okay, so now Farrar, in a work called The Life and Works of St. Paul, explains the meanings of Latin's name, of Paul's name. He says Paulus is a contraction of, and he actually had it wrong, and I think that's important for you to know, of Pauxililis, means least, and he thought it was Pauxilis. And this shows you the level of sophistication of whoever knows Paul's real name had to know it wasn't Pauxilis. Pauxilis in Latin means lesser. And then Pauxililis is double the meaning of that, and it means least. So this is all, Paulus is a contraction of, the same contraction applies to both lesser and least. So the only way to know, is it lesser or least, is it Pauxilis or Pauxililis, is two people in the world, or maybe three. Paul himself would know his name means least, or his mother or father. but nobody else could know because you'd have to know, is it proxylus, lesser, or is it least? And in those days, if you know anything about Latin famous people, sometimes they're called the lesser, sometimes they're called the least. But Paul had the name least. All right, so now I want you to see this. Let me see here. See this word, proxylus? Okay, this is what contracts into the word proxylus, as we'll see somewhere else. And do you see where it says over here? I've got to get this right. Okay, there it is. See, it says the least that can be, oops, these are not easy to control, or extraordinarily few. Do you see this? So this is a word that you have to dig out of the old texts, and I could not find a Latin dictionary any older than this that said proxylus meant least. So this was the only one I could find, or was the oldest one I could find, and this is by London. It's hard to read that. 1677, right there. It says it right there. So anyway, that's how we know what this is, and he's saying the abbreviations here is, let me just see if I can highlight this for you. He is saying it's an adjective, and it means diminutive, derived from proxylus. So just one thing you need to know. See, proxylus is more extreme than proxylus. So proxylus means lesser, and proxylus means least. And how do we know it means least? Because we see over here on the right, it means least. And so that's how you do it. And okay, so we'll move on from this. So London Holyoke was the book. So that's how you know what it is, and that's how you know how sophisticated a knowledge whoever wrote this. And I believe it could only be by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, because there's no way Matthew, a speaker of Aramaic or Hebrew in Judea in the year 30s whatever AD, is not going to have this level of knowledge of Latin. I mean, I can also say students of Latin might not know any of this extremely delicate detail, but a native speaker of Latin who was very sophisticated, like Augustine, could easily spot this in a second, but not somebody who wasn't a native speaker. And Matthew for sure is not a native speaker of Latin. He is writing and speaks in Hebrew with Jesus, or Aramaic, on a regular basis. So he's not going to be a native speaker of Latin. So then this gets back to, why does Paul call himself least in 1 Corinthians 15:9? And how did Augustine recognize this? So the church of the 400s knew Latin and recognized Paul as playing on the meaning of his name in Latin. Augustine, in a 4th century sermon, infers that the Latin meaning of Paulus is what Paul is alluding to in 1 Corinthians 15:9. So as we'll see, you're going to see the very nice, gentle Protestant commentators, who usually are sweet as pie, have nothing but hatred towards Matthew, or some Judaizer who allegedly corrupted Matthew 5:17 to point at Paul. Now that they know it means it's whoever wrote Matthew 5:17, it has to be this evil person to attack Paul in this way. So they don't blame Jesus because he's too nice, right? Jesus wouldn't have any he couldn't have any miraculous knowledge about Paul, right? And he couldn't be adverse to Paul, right? So it has to be Matthew, and it has to be some Judaizer, some evil, corrupt, hateful person. So these are the two options you'll get when I get to the end of the story here of how this is handled. But I'm going to ask you to be objective for the moment and keep calm. Now that you know that this is an anti-Paul passage. Is this a prophecy of Jesus, or is it hate of Paul by Matthew, or some Judaizer who gets control of the Matthew manuscript? That would have to be Matthew or someone close to him. Okay, one way or the other. So I'm just going to say it's either Jesus or hate by Matthew. The knowledge of Latin required here would be a very refined knowledge. In fact, of its superlative, or what's known as the double diminutive ending of the Latin word paucus. So this all starts from a little word, paucus. You've heard of In Italian, the native language of my of my grandparents, so they say poco poco. That meant little by little, you know. So it's paucus is a very well-known adjective in Latin, Italian, but the diminutive form in Latin isn't very common, and the double diminutive form would be even less common. Okay, so that's what we're looking at. So um, whoever was the parents of Paul and Paul have to know, is it the proxylilus? Let me see if I can highlight this. This is very hard to control. See over here? Proxylus is lesser, so that's one option. That also contracts to Paulus the same way. Or is it the double diminutive, which is over here, the least? See, this is a hard call. How do you know? Only the parents. Only Paul knows this, because you would have to see his actual birth certificate. Because just like anything else, you know, William, we'll call someone William, and then he'll be known Billy for the rest of his life. We change it around to something that is more friendly. So to call someone, hey, Parksalilis, that's your name, you know, hey, thanks mom and dad for calling me Sue on my birth certificate. You know, that's a long name, and it takes a long time to spell out. And then your parents say, don't worry, we can call you. You're going to be known as Paulus. It's very easy. Everybody will remember that, you know, you're just Paulus, and they'll never even know your name was double diminutive Parksalilis. Okay, so that's the reality of this. Okay, so this level of sophistication, that's not something a Hebrew apostle or any other Jew in that era would remotely have a chance to know, even if that person met Paul and knew the name Paul went by was Paul. Only someone like Jesus or a native Latin speaker would know this about Paul's name. That's the truth. You can erase Matthew, you can erase a Judaizer. You've got to choose Jesus. That is the only choice, unless a Roman is writing the New Testament. Right? That's it. You're left with no other possibility but the Lord Jesus Christ. And let's keep going. I'm going to make this even more clear if you haven't gotten it already. I think it's clear already, but we're going to keep going at it because it's important. This is key. So let's start where this got known by Augustine. He picked it up from the Greek adjective elichistos in 1 Corinthians. Paul referring to himself as the elichistos, or the least. What else is significant? Paul uses this about himself. He calls himself the least of the apostles. It's not extraordinary for someone to play on the meaning of their own name. And since Paul is bilingual, he can speak Greek, by the way. It's very clear in the book of Acts, chapter 22, when he asks permission from the Roman officer, can I speak to the crowd at the temple? Paul speaks to him actually in Greek, because the Roman official or legionnaire or whatever turns to him and says, I can see you can speak Greek. So Paul knows Greek, and so he knows his name is elichistos in Greek, and he writes his epistles in Greek, or he has someone assist him writing them in Greek. So that's one of those unique things about Paul. He writes, he speaks, and he reads Greek. Now let's go to the word least in Matthew 5:19. It's also the same Greek adjective. It's elikistos, but it's in the feminine ending, elikoston, because it's an adjective modifying a feminine word. But it's the same adjective as in 1 Corinthians 15:9. So think about what's happening here. Paul says, I am the least of the apostles. And Jesus says, the one who's going to teach you against the law, who's not going to be in heaven, and under Matthew 5:20, he's going to be called by the name of elikistos. Elikoston, excuse me. So it's the same exact adjective, just simply change endings because of it's an adjective, and that's how it works. So 3, thus both in 1 Corinthians 15:9 and Matthew 5:19 use the same word to express least. The same word in Greek. In Latin, the word for least is proxylilus, which is Paulus when contracted. We've already established that. So this is the gist of what you need to have to make a decision, because you're now going to have to decide, what is this? And we're going to read the commentary that throws it all on a hateful Matthew or some Judaizing ally of Matthew. Okay, before we get there, we're going to read over again Matthew 5:19. Whoever therefore may loose one of these commands the least, and may teach men so, least, he shall be called in the reign of the heavens. He's not there. He's going to be called that by those who are in the kingdom of heavens. But whoever may do and may teach them, teach the law, he shall be called great in the reign of the heavens. So we get to see this contrast. So Jesus is actually teaching an important moral lesson about the value of teaching the law. You would be called great, and you basically secure your spot in the kingdom of heaven by being a teacher, not holding the title teacher, but teaching, verb, the commands of God to help people follow God. All right, so I think I'm going to end this as part 1 to keep this at a reasonable length. And so we will get back to you with a part 2 where this will be continued. And I hope you're getting a lot out of this, and you will be willing to share this with other people so that they will, who are on the fence, they don't know why you believe what you believe, and you have this absolute prophecy of Jesus Christ that you can refer them to. So let's give this to people. It's unquestionable, right? Okay. All right, so look for part 2.